In this video, we are going to discuss logical operators and how they function within conditional statements like an if statement. So in C++, as we've discussed, there are things called relational operators, which are things like equals equals, not equals, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to. And so this covers whenever we want to compare two objects to each other. But there are also things called logical operators, and these are useful for checking conditions. And these are things, there are pretty much only two. We have and or. And this one kind of looks like an 11, but it's actually the button above enter. You just hold shift and then push the button above enter. It's called a pipe, and it's two of them together, so that's important. And likewise, here we have two ampersands for our and sign, and this is shift and 7. So I'll just put shift 7 just as a reference there. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at exactly how these function. So the and operator, which as I mentioned, that is this up here, the two ampersands. How and works is if an if statement has an and, like we can see right here on line 12, right there on line 12, then both of those conditions, or in other words, every condition that is that has an and associated with it must be true in order for that if statement to execute. So in the case of line 12, we have if true and true. So we can reasonably guess that that is going to execute, because we're saying if this condition is true and if this condition is true, then this statement will execute. So we have if true and true. So that's how and works. Or works in that if one or more condition is true, then the statement will execute. So in the case of if true or true, then once again that will execute. And if we take a look, if true or false, since one of those conditions is true, this statement will execute. So really quick, just to kind of emphasize this point, if we take a look at, let's make kind of a complex one. If we have if true, and then we'll do some more parentheses. So if we'll say if true or true and false. And then we'll go ahead and just see out true or true and false. So go ahead and just think about this for a second, whether or not this will or will not execute. And so keep in mind that what happens is we do an order of operations type of scenario where what is located within the inner parentheses gets resolved first. And so we have if true and false, and that's going to be false because both conditions are not true, or not every condition is true. But then we have if true or, and then this will just resolve to be simply false. And then we have if true or false, and since true is true, then this will execute. But if we have this as false, then we end up with false or false. And this is kind of tricky, and once again, this is kind of a complicated or advanced compound if statement, if you will. So that's not as important about learning just the basics, which we have here. So here we have a list of basically every option that we can have when dealing with and or logical operators. Because, I mean, the most basic ones would be if true. And so actually, let's go ahead and just add that in here. See out true. And then we also, of course, will have if false. And then we'll just have false. And so what's actually happening inside here is this gets resolved to be simply either true or false. And then if it's true, then it executes. And if it's false, then it doesn't execute. And so when we have this, then we see, okay, if true and true, is this condition true? If so, then it looks something like this when it gets resolved once again. But that's not super important. That's kind of behind the scenes things. But just so that you're aware of how that works. So let's go ahead and step through this and just let's think about which ones of these will execute and which ones won't. And then we'll go ahead and run it and see how close we were. So just kind of keep track in your mind. So if true, obviously this one will execute. I'll give you that one. And if false, obviously that one won't execute. And now we have if true and true. So kind of think to yourselves whether or not that will execute or will not. And then if true and false. And then if false and true. And then if false and false. And then we'll jump into the ors of if true or true. And then if true or false. If false or true. And then if false or false. And so hopefully you kind of thought to yourself, okay, this one will, this one won't, and so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and run it and just see how close you were. So here we can see, let's go ahead and hide this for a second. The following combinations will execute. So if true, okay, perfect. True and true, okay. And then you'll notice that none of the other and statements executed. But then when we go down to false, we actually have when we go down to the or statements, we actually have 3 of the or statements that executed successfully. True or true, true or false, false or true, and then of course false or false will not execute. One thing, you'll see that these basically look the exact same, if true and false, and if false and true. You can treat these as exactly the same. There is a tiny difference between the two, but not enough to actually make any sort of difference, so it doesn't really matter. But I just wanted to show you every possible combination. And so this pretty much concludes our video on logical operators and how they're used. Just a reminder, we have and or. And works in that every statement that is paired with an and, both statements in this condition, must be true in order for it to execute. And then an or, simply one of any of the statements inside the condition must be true in order for that to execute.